Corrections Notebook, Week 29. Community-based corrections. Here we transition from institutional corrections to community-based corrections. We talked all about jails and prisons, and now we're going to talk about probation and parole and a few other things. If I can get parole. Only inmates who are in state prison get paroled, not jail. Parole is not a sentence or a guarantee. It is a gift. You are given parole. You are not guaranteed parole. After serving 2/3 of his minimum sentence, an inmate may apply for parole. He will go in front of a parole board to try to convince them that he is no longer a danger to society and that he has been rehabilitated. And by the way, the parole board is made up of people who are appointed by the governor of the state. And unfortunately, they often don't have any real criminal justice background. It's a political favor. It's a very nice job, and the governor basically gives these spots to his friends. And they travel the state every month, going to facilities once a month to hold parole hearings. The parole board will consider the seriousness of the crime that was committed as well as what the inmate has done while incarcerated. So the good things, going to program, going to school, you learned about that in the last couple of weeks. Those are very good things that look very positive for the inmate for parole. The parole board definitely wants to see these kinds of activities. But then they're going to also look at the bad. So while you have been incarcerated during your time, were you involved in fights? Were you involved in disturbances? Did you break the rules? This picture here is showing you some handmade weapons. We call these shanks in the corrections biz. And then you have other kinds of contraband like drug paraphernalia and drugs. So any of those things, basically anything you're not supposed to have is going to be considered contraband and you can get in trouble. So the parole board looks at these things as well. Kind of hard to convince them that you've rehabilitated yourself if you're still getting in trouble inside the facility. Right. So there are state correctional staff who work with the inmates to get them ready for parole. That they work in the prisons. And their whole job, they're not corrections officers, they're pretty much parole staff or parole officers. Their job is to get that inmate ready for release. And before, even if the parole board says, yes, we're going to give you parole, you have to meet other criteria. And for example, you have to have an approved residence. So they're going to ask you, give us an address. Where do you plan on living? And when the inmate gives the address, a field parole officer goes and makes a visit to that residence before the inmate is released. And the parole officer has to give approval that it's an okay place for the inmate to live. And that includes whatever people that inmate may or parolee plans on living with. You actually have to have a job lined up before you get out of prison. Now, how the heck do you pull that off? Well, there are employers who specifically hire parolees. And why do they do that? Because they get a tax break, the tax credits. And my screen here is covering up the words. And so the parole officer inside the facility knows of these employers that the inmate can reach out to before they're even released to find out if they can have a job with them. And this picture here it's showing a dishwasher, and honestly, those are the common kinds of jobs. They're they're minimum wage, menial labor, but it's something. And the parolee has to agree to all other conditions of parole. Well, there's a lot of conditions. And they're told this, they're explained this all very clearly before they're released. There's no surprises, and nobody's trying to trick them to get them into trouble. But they have to understand and agree to all this, or there's no point in getting released on parole. So, some typical conditions of regular parole. You will have a curfew. Doesn't matter how old you are. If your curfew is 9 o'clock at night, 7 days a week, that is your curfew. And the parole officer in the field will check from time to time, unannounced, to make sure that you're there. The parole officer, and by the way, I'm just saying PO for short here, the PO will make random home visits, and they can search your residence, and that includes anybody that you live with. They don't need a search warrant. This is different than policing and citizens. You, as an inmate, as a parolee, you are still under the control and supervision of corrections. You're not completely free. You gave up your Fourth Amendment right when you got convicted of a crime. So as long as you're on supervision, they can randomly come and check your house, make sure you're there. They can search your dresser, search under your cushions, any place that they want to, for drugs and weapons and any other thing that you're not supposed to have. You will have drug testing, either once a month mandatory or random drug testing. And let me just go back for a second to the searches, and I mentioned that includes anybody that you live with. They are explained all this when the field parole officer goes to the house to check it to see if it's going to be an okay place to live. They will explain all this to that person. So let's say a parolee wants to go live with his sister for a while. The sister understands she's under the same rules as the inmate. So she may not have a curfew, but let's say that the parolee is not to have any alcohol. That means no alcohol can be in the home. And it doesn't matter if it belongs to the sister or she bought it. That's a violation of that for that parolee. So I mentioned the drug testing, monthly office visits to the PO. So the parolee goes and does an office visit to the parole officer, and the parole officer makes a house visit, and it goes back and forth like that. Usually for regular parole, once a month. You parolee may not leave the county without permission. You got a family event, a wedding, a funeral, something going on outside of the county, you cannot just go. You have to get permission. And we'll talk about violations of these rules, but you could be sent back to prison if you are caught violating any of these rules. You may not move your residence or change your job without permission or without notifying your parole officer immediately. Like if you just quit your job spur of the moment, or you got fired spur of the moment, your very first step is to make a phone call to your parole officer to tell them. That doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get sent back to prison, but what do you think they're going to want them to do? Immediately start looking for another job. But the moving thing, that's definite. You can't just do that without permission. The parole officer will make random visits to your employer as well. And, just to make sure you're there, to talk to the employer, make sure everything's going okay. You have to immediately notify your parole officer of any police contact. So if you get pulled over on a traffic stop for speeding, you have to call your PO. Okay, speeding is a traffic violation. It's not a crime, but you still have to notify your PO. Or if the police are in your neighborhood, they're looking for somebody, they talk to you, they want to know if you saw whoever or whatever, you're going to immediately call your PO and tell them what happened. It doesn't mean you're going to get in trouble, but you have to realize that local law enforcement is in constant communication with parole officers. They work together all the time. And so if the parole officer, or let me reverse that. If a police officer sees a PO and is like, hey, I saw your guy, Billy Bob, had to talk to him the other night because they had an armed robbery on the street and blah, 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 that PO had already better know about it. He does not want to be hearing that firsthand from the officer. He wants to hear it from the parolee. So again, it doesn't mean he's going to get in trouble. And obviously, if the parolee is under suspicion of committing a crime or in fact gets arrested for something else, that's like a no-brainer. Immediately that parole officer has to get called and you probably will get violated. You may not associate, darn it, sorry guys, you may not associate with any known criminals, and this includes family and spouses, and this is during the duration of your parole supervision. So however long you might be on parole, it might be only a couple of years, it might be more than that, but it isn't to make your life miserable. It's the fact of, we know people get in trouble when they hang around with other people who get in trouble. The last thing we want is for parolees associating with other criminal types. And the problem is, very often, all of their friends and all of their family are people that are involved in criminal activity because they didn't, I'm not saying all of the time, but often, that's how they got in trouble to begin with. That's how they got started in doing crimes. So they're just not going to be able to live with those people. They're not going to be able to hang out with those people. They're not going to be able to associate. And that even includes, girlfriend, boyfriend, husband, wife. Very often you'll find that they are co-defendants, like usually with drug dealing, and they have kids together. They have to, if they're still together, they can't live together, they can't be together until they're off of parole supervision. Okay, I'm going to pause it here because I think the video is already getting long. We'll talk about intensive supervision parole next video. If I can get this to stop.